Okay, welcome to H3. I am the acapellas, and with me is Brother Scott Sweetman. We have a full agenda tonight, don't we, Brother Scott?
Oh, we are packed house. We may split this one into two. We've got some heavy hitters on the agenda tonight. Imagination and fantasy. Woo.
Imagination and fantasy. I want to learn more. Let's just summarize. Remember, there was two types of pride. What were they again? Authentic pride and hubristic pride. Is that correct?
Right on the money, brother. 100%.
And authentic pride is where you take pride in yourself as being a unique human being who has had the only experiences. You've had unique experiences. Nobody else has had the experiences you've had. You've had relationships with people that other people have not had. You've learned things that other people have not learned. You have different abilities and capacities, some that come very easily to you, others that, things you struggle with. I am a slow learner. It takes me a long time to learn things. When I get it, I'm really good at it, but I'm a slow learner. Okay. But anyways, whatever you are is basically what is being about authentic pride. Hubristic pride is when you are saying, I'm better than that person because look, I can shoot a basketball further. I can, whatever the thing is. No place for it. It makes no sense. Worry about being you and being your personal best.
Brilliant summary.
I love that part. And let's get for tonight there, Scott Sweetman.
That was brilliant. Thanks, Alan. Very, very well said. And yeah, you're the only one in your own race. That's what it comes down to, right?
Exactly.
So tonight we're going to talk about imagination, and fantasy is sort of a linguistic, and we're going to talk about how that comes out of imagination. I found that pretty cool. What's your just shooting from the hip? What's imagination?
Imagination, like versus fantasy, or
imagination? What is imagination?
Okay, so I think imagination is the capacity to see things that don't exist.
Oh, good. That's one. And that ties right into my linguistic discussion about fantasy, because linguistically, it has a similar root to the Greek phantasm, right? Which we think of phantasm to mean like a ghost or a spirit, is our modern understanding of phantom, right?
Right.
Meaning ghost. But actually, the Greek, if you go back to classical discussions, it's really meaning something that the mind sees.
That's what the mind sees.
Yes, that's both the root of, and I'm bastardizing it, so whatever. But that's where the root of fantasy, phantasm, even our word for types of imagination come from, that idea that it's something that the mind sees that isn't necessarily something that the eyes see.
Okay.
Which I think is pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So it sounds like you're saying fantasy would always be kind of an internal experience, if you will. Imagination can be internalized or shared, or others come into the delivery of the imagined future that is so much nicer, brighter, cleaner, better, right? That kind of a thing.
Except now dystopian futures are popular, which is the opposite of nice and better.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Yeah.
So, okay.
But
I am an optimist. I don't know if you know that about me, Scott Sweetman.
I do, and I appreciate that about you. But actually, there's 8 different types of imagination. There's 2 basic roots, and then there's 8 types off of those roots.
Tell me more.
Yeah.
Tell me more.
So, well, I'm going to back up because we're getting a little ahead of things. And I want to talk first about what's over the last, 2 decades. There's been a lot of development in science and imaging, as you know, given your field of employee benefits and, having a lot to do with the medical field. And personally, you're interested in that, right? You do a lot of research and things that can make our life experiences better. And so over the last 2 decades, electronic and magnetic and all sorts of new imaging tools have become more prevalent in science. And so that's really helped a lot of things. But in the area of neurology, it's really helped us move ahead quickly. Because, of course, it's not like a heart, which is a muscle, right? Our brain, once we're dead and you dissect it, you can say, oh, this tissue is diseased, this tissue looks normal, but it doesn't give any insight at all how it was functioning when we were alive, right? And there was all sorts of, at the turn of the century, all sorts of weird things with electronic, they would take like a prisoner and cut the back of their skull off, and they would stick in electric probes and give a little jolt, and their eyelid would blink, or their hand would blink, and they would map that out that way. That's an incredibly crude, that basically gave us only functional data about what parts of the brain are connected to what physical parts of our body. But with this new imaging, we get this amazing 3D picture of what parts of our brain are firing, what they call it, what parts of our brain are active during stimulus. And stimulus is basically anything that we sense, and maybe things that we don't sense. We'll get into that a little bit more. So this is important. What I'm getting to is because when they fire up this equipment, there's not a lot of difference between our brains when we actually experience something and when we imagine something. The image of the brain working is almost identical, right? So yes, there's something that says this is real and this is not real, of course, filters, but to the mechanism of our brain, imagination is pretty close to reality. And there's a great line. You remember those old commercials? This is your brain, and they would drop an egg in a frying pan. And they would say, "This is your brain on crack," and they'd crank the frying pan up, and the egg would, So this article came with the tagline, "Your brain on imagination. It's a lot like reality." So, which is kind of the point. That a lot of studies in the last 2 decades have shown that imagination is not some weird side effect or some abnormality of the human condition. Like,
hey, can I just interject? Do you believe imagination to be a capacity that you can develop, that you can expand? Right?
I have pointers on how to do that. Scientific proof on how to improve your imagination.
I'm with you 100%.
On H3, brother. Yeah. So, yeah. And based on the last 2 decades where we can actually say, okay, our brain is doing this. And
did I ruin the surprise for you now? I'm sorry. Did I ruin the surprise? You're going to hold
No. There's so many surprises in this research. Like, I went down the rabbit hole. And then I got into some really old classic dissertations on psychology and phantasms, and it was beautiful, man. My brain was just like going. I'm sure everything was all lit up in there. Anyway, so let's start all of this tonight by saying that your brain on imagination is pretty much like your brain any other time. Like, it's not some weird, like they used to think that your imagination was some weak area. When I was a kid, I used to get kicked in the backside for daydreaming. You ever get that? Right. Like in school, whack back in the head. Stop daydreaming, Sweetman. Pay attention. You get that? You ever get that? Or just
I did. Yeah. I think that, and a lot of, would you shut the fuck up once in a while?
They used to call me the Wanderer because I would just wander in class. Yeah, the principal and I got to be good friends over that, actually. But yeah, but they have found that imagination, daydreaming, it's a modality of our brain, and it's beneficial. It's not sort of our what's it called on a phone or a computer where you put it to sleep, like a ready state. We used to think that somehow our imagination was, our brain's just taking a little break, right?
Right.
Yeah. No, not. They're not. It's not taking a break.
Cool.
Yeah. So actually, what they found, and a lot of this research at first came out of psychologists trying to help people with traumatic experiences. Huge explosion in research and treatment after the Gulf Wars, right? Because of those traumatic experiences. But 1 in 3 people in North America suffer from a phobia, an anxiety, or another mental condition directly related to a traumatic experience of some type.
Yeah. Hey, let's interject right now for our viewers. about Dr. Peter Levine and Ray's story. Google Dr. Peter Levine and Ray's story. It'll blow your mind. It's like 23 minutes long, but about the number of people who've experienced trauma in their life. Some of the tools that Dr. Levine or others would teach, you could use them even if you have not experienced major trauma, and they will still be beneficial for you. Because I know I tried a bunch of them and I've adopted the best ones for me, and they work really, really well. Carry on.
And we're going to talk about some of those things. But anyway, coming out of all of that trauma was the need to help people that were trying to reintegrate, that had come back from the conflict overseas, to help people that had been assaulted, abused, all of the litany of trauma. And as you and I have discussed in many, many shows, all trauma is trauma. You can't say, oh, this is little trauma, this is big trauma. Trauma be trauma, period. So
Definitely.
all of us have trauma.
And how much does it vary with the sensitivity of the person as well? There's some people that are just more naturally sensitive than others, right? So if you're a sensitive person, yeah, this level of trauma might impact you that much, whereas other people, it might be this kind of an impact, right? And what is your support network? Who could you tell about what you experienced, who is an empathetic, caring human, probably like an uncle, aunt, whatever, if it wasn't your mom and dad, that you could tell. In telling and hearing from an empathetic listener, the damaging, the caustic part of that traumatic event doesn't stay with you. It dissipates.
Well, and tied in with that telling is that often we don't want to accuse somebody because it's not somebody's fault, like our parents, right? You and I are both parents. I'm sure we've messed up our kids horrible ways, trying to be the best parents we could be, right? Like neither you and I have ever wanted anything ever bad. We made sacrifices to make sure it didn't happen to our kids. But guaranteed, if you've got kids, somehow you've caused trauma, somehow. Guaranteed, right?
I know I have. Yeah, I know I have.
Yeah. And my daughters are good enough. They usually let me know right then and there that I have caused them trauma. And then they dish some of that trauma right back on old dad, which is fair enough, I guess. But anyway, getting back to this whole scientific thing, and you've talked about some ways that psychology and science have been working to deal with trauma, right? Do you want to run through a couple of those just to remind people? I think it's important.
Well, sure.
You've got a couple of favorites, right? That's I'm setting you up here, bro.
Say that again.
I said you've got a couple of favorites treatment for trauma.
I do.
And I'm setting it up so you can share those, because I think low cost, anyone can try them, right? Why not?
This is super, super easy. Doesn't cost you a nickel. Takes you like 2 minutes to try it. If it doesn't work for you, doesn't work for you. But if it does, it's a pretty amazing tool. When I told you about Dr. Peter Levine, this is his go-to move, his VU breath. And basically it is this. You just inhale, and as you inhale, allow your stomach to extend, right? That your diaphragm is fully extended. And then just exhale in through the nose. Now this time add a little vocalization to it. So if you do that more than a couple times, you do it like 5 times in a row, you just about want to have a nap. You feel so relaxed. But there's absolutely no harm it can cause you. And I find it is a good, like if I'm having troubles remembering something, the lyric to a song. I'll stop, do a VU breath. Oh, there it is. Got it. The name of a person. Do a VU breath. Oh, yeah, Peter. Right. Okay. Give Peter a call. And I have an amazing memory, but that VU breath helps my memory even get better.
That's
Okay.
excellent. You can be a beginner like me. I'm a beginner viewer. I can't last as long as Alan does, but I find it does help. And I feel bad for somebody who might have tuned in the middle of that and see us both with our eyes closed going, "Ooh."
Oh.
So that may make them watch the rest of the show. So that's good. Yeah.
Did I tell you about my friend Richard that at the BNI golf thing?
No.
Okay, so Richard is kind of the area manager for BNI or area coach for BNI. A lovely, lovely gentleman. And so we were golfing together, and I was golfing barefoot. And what I did was every time I addressed the ball, I would be singing through the stroke, singing or doing a VU breath, one of the two. And Richard, he started off and he had like, terrible, terrible schwacks and that kind of stuff. So I went over and said, hey, you know what? Why don't you just try this VU breath thing for, when you do this, right? So anyways, he tried it and I kept on reminding him. Sometimes I'd do it when he was preparing to hit the ball like I just did, right? Anyways, he had his best golf game ever, right? The VU breath worked for him. So it was amazing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Another
Yeah.
convert. Well, we're going to talk about tonight, and I'm going to explain a way that imagination can be helpful with people with phobias or trauma. I am not a doctor. I don't represent myself as one. If you need help, get yourself some help. 211. Like I remember that right?
211. Yeah. 211.
Unfortunately, it's 311, I think, in Britain. Anyway, there's depending on where you are, but here it's 211, right? Right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. So what they found is we've established that imagination and reality are pretty close in brain function, right?
Yep.
Like my rabbit hands. Anyway, so what they did is they took a test and they took a bunch of people, divided it in 3 groups. And then they made a tone and they zapped everyone, right? And a few times of that, they created an association between this tone and the unpleasant sensation of getting zapped. I don't know how ethical this study was, but anyway, no one was harmed, apparently. No one had a heart attack. And then they divided the group into 3 groups. And one group, they played the tone and zapped them again. The other group, they said to imagine the tone. Okay. And the third group, they said to imagine birds singing or waterfalls, right? Mm-hmm. Now, that may seem a little strange, but this is coming out of that healing again for trauma. And it was always sort of felt that, you could replace bad things with good thoughts, right? Don't think about the bad things. Go to your happy place, right? So the third group doing bird songs and waterfalls, that's what they were supposed to be representing, was going to your happy place. So the people in the ZAP group, no change. Of course, they're the control group. They experienced the same anxiety. As soon as they heard that tone, their brains lighten up and they're going, oh, here it comes. They got it. The people who imagined the tone almost had identical fear responses to the people who heard the tone.
Really?
Yep. And the people who imagined the waterfall and things, no change. Nothing. Didn't affect their anxiety level, even when they played the tone out loud. It didn't take away the fear and anxiety. So they said, okay, now let's see how we can change this. So we found out that actually none of those 3 things just on their own make a difference, right? So imagining the tone is just like hearing the tone. Imagining something else doesn't take away the fear of what's going to happen. You still feel that fear, maybe just hidden. So then what they did is let me get this right. I don't want to get this part wrong because it's how the test is done. So what they did is they wanted to reduce the phobia. And so they had the second group, the people that were imagining the tone, they wanted to build on that. And what they did was they had people imagine the tone again and again without the shock. Okay. So and then the other group imagined the waterfall, whatever, and the other group didn't do anything. So when they brought the shock back, when they played the tone again to all three groups, the only group that was better was the group that had imagined the tone over and over again, that had imagined the tone and the shock again and again. And it had basically inoculated them to the fear of the zap. It didn't take the zap away, but it took the fear away. And so, do you follow me? Are you with me so far?
Thank. Okay, but wait a minute. Let me back up for just a second. The third group, they were just fearful, even though they were listening to birds or waterfalls or whatever they were listening to. They were fearful they were going to hear the tone, that the tone might come and cause anxiety. So they were, their anxiety level stayed high.
They didn't neutralize it. And then when they went back, so the first part, basically everyone stayed the same. There was no change. When the stimulus was there, not there, none of those things had any difference, really. Okay. So if something bad has happened, thinking happy thoughts on its own doesn't help you feel better, according to this test. Also, it doesn't help you when that scary thing presents itself again, right? So let's say you have a phobia of getting electrocuted every time you hear bong tone, right? So the only people that developed an immunity to the bong tone were the people who relived the experience in their memory and assigned it less and less fear.
Wow. You know what this reminds me of? EMDR. You know, and here's what I'm thinking of. Are you familiar with it? EMDR?
Yes, right. Please explain it again.
Okay, so eye movement desensitization and reprogramming. So the counselor, the therapist, basically kind of asks you about something that has impact in your life, a belief, an event that occurred, so a trauma that occurred that you have attributed a lot of significance to. And let's say this is that trauma, this triangle is that trauma. And your connection to that trauma is significant. It's like a cord attaching you to that trauma. So with EMDR, it's basically where you have some bilateral eye movement back and forth, and then the therapist suggests to you, that the significance of that event is reducing. It's diminishing in its size and strength and power. And further, the cord that attaches that to you, that binds you, is getting thinner and thinner and thinner. And then ultimately that it is just like a thread, just a one thread that you can just pluck and it's gone, right? So the event, the trauma becomes smaller and smaller and smaller, and the attachment to it becomes less and less and less until it has no real impact on your life at all in a negative way. So
which is basically what I'm describing here, which they call exposure therapy, where you use imagination. And I know, as you know, I've got a lot of friends that are vets and people that have served in the military and other protection services. And one of the things that they've started doing with VR is counterintuitive, is putting those vets back in a combat situation. And, the explosions, the flashing lights, all of those triggering things, but in a safe environment. So, maybe in the beginning, they can only take a second of it. And then they can maybe take 3 seconds of it. And then 4 seconds of it. And then, they can pull off the VR and look around and everyone's alive and they're okay. They're hyperventilating and they're, in full PSD mode. But they're using virtual reality to put them in that combat situation without the outcome of their friends and, teammates dying.
That's very interesting.
And that's basically an extension of the test I was talking about, where exposure therapy. So again, I'm not a doctor. I'm not suggesting that people who this has no benefit for are wrong. Just sharing some information where there has been a lot of research that, the idea of thinking about good things and just don't think about the bad thing that happened is not necessarily the answer for everyone. but there's a lot of benefit in thinking about the trauma and saying, okay, every time let's say you were in a bad car accident. I was, when I was 16, fell asleep, rolled a car 3 times end over end on the highway, and then about 6 or 7 more times down the berm. It was out by Hannah with the big long ditches there. Police thought I was dead. There was nothing left in my car. I got thrown out after like the 4th flip or something. Luckily, the car went one way and I went the other way. And a long time, when I fell asleep in a car, I woke up screaming for 3, 4, 5 years. And so let's say a car is your trigger. And I can talk about that because I've been there. So you've had a bad car accident. And then people say, oh, put on happy music in the car and, try and think good things. And, you had one bad experience, you're not necessarily going to have another bad experience. I can tell you it didn't matter what I listened to. It didn't matter what I did. For a couple of years after, I woke up screaming, man. If I fell asleep in a car, I woke up with a scream. Freaked out whoever was driving. It was not a pleasant experience for anyone. What cured that is falling asleep in a car enough times that finally I just seemed to disassociate falling asleep in a car with that horrific accident.
Right. Wow. Yeah.
And so the things that I tried, replacing it with positive memories didn't really help. What helped me was just going through it enough times and not getting hurt that my brain's, like you said, that thread, when it first happened, when I fell asleep in a car, I almost immediately woke up with a scream, and slowly over time, falling asleep again and again and again and again in a car. I'm not saying people should go out and experience their trauma again. But the trigger is separate from the trauma, right?
Hey, let's just interject right here that our intent is to provide information and thoughts, ideas that you might try that would improve your health, make your life better. That sometimes the best intentions lead to undesired consequences. So if anything we're saying is triggering for you, or you disagree with it, or you think we're lacking sensitivity in that regard, 1, we would welcome your constructive criticism. And then 2, 211. Call 211 if we've triggered anything for you where there's different ideas, they work for some people, and whatever you've tried, if it hasn't worked for you, that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with you. It means it just hasn't worked for you, whatever you've tried before. Here's some different things you might never try before. Maybe it works for you. That VU breath, I tell you what, I use it all the time. I start every morning with 10 minutes of VU breathing. And then I also will incorporate it during the day as well. It's magical.
But if that makes you feel self-conscious, if that makes you feel silly, Al's not saying you have to do it. He's just saying it works for him. So that's our underlying message, right? And we talk about these things because lots of people don't want to talk about them. And we think that talking about things that people don't normally talk about is often a good way to explore healthy options and a good way to explore maximizing your health. And just staying quiet doesn't help anyone, we think. So
you are entirely right, Brother Scott. Hey, we're making this a 2-part. Where was the part where you were going to say we're moved to the set part 2?
We're not quite there yet, brother. We've only been here 28 minutes, so you gotta hang in there another few minutes.
Okay, good. You go. Okay.
So that's how imagination is being used to deal with trauma and those types of things, right? So neuroscience is helping us a lot, but we're moving into
is the 3D gear, like remember you were saying about, these veterans going out and having this experience, but in a no risk environment. Nobody's going to get killed. Nobody's going to get hurt, right? I get that. That makes real good sense. But is that really imagination when you've got all the gear that's pouring the data into you? Like, isn't imagination... Go ahead.
That's how you define imagination. And we're going to get into that. So,
okay.
Yeah. Just to recap, the summary by the scientist who did that, Dr. Radan, said that statistically, real and imagined exposure to the threat were not different at the whole brain level, and imagination worked just as well. So they didn't have to expose people to the trauma again. They didn't have to expose people to the trigger again. they clinically, and this is all done in a clinic, this is under the supervision of doctors that I'm talking about, exposing them to the imagination, encouraging them to imagine the trigger, and then to be in a safe and supportive environment, helped essentially to teach the brain or unlearn the brain to be afraid of that trigger or stimulus. That may help. Okay. What we want to look at now is, and Al brought it up, what is imagination, right? Imagination, there's two main schools of imagination, and I'm just skipping around in my notes to compress everything here. There is constructive imagination and reproduction imagination. Okay. And those two get broken into 8. But I'm going to deal with the 2. And this is where we're dealing in the field of psychology and skipping into philosophy a little bit here. Okay. So reproduction, I want to get this right. Reproduction imagination is kind of memory. So that's where, like, if I ask you to remember your childhood house, what you do is you take bits of memory. You know, I remember it being red. I remember it was 2 stories. I remember there was a door on the front. And so your mind is pulling all of this information like a database, and it's reproducing the image of your childhood house.
Okay.
One way to describe that is memory, although that's inaccurate because it's not really a memory. It's a collective imagination of bits of memory.
Cool. Okay, so that's the reproductive one.
Right. And creative imagination is where you take, and I don't like to swear, but I'm going to make this example. And one scientist said it this way: if I told you, which do you like more, a penguin or a shit sandwich, you don't ever have to have experienced a shit sandwich to choose the penguin.
Right. Fair enough.
Your brain stops on the ingredients. Yeah. Sandwich, bread, shit, not my food, don't want. Okay. So you create an image, although I'm sure somewhere somebody's made one, but you and I create an image of a poop sandwich, and we don't want it. We've created that. We've never experienced it, but we take pieces that are not connected and bring them together and create something new.
Okay. Well, that's an interesting distinction. Okay. Cool. Okay.
So that's the distinction in psychology. There's many other types. And when you start to think about it, that's really interesting, because it means that I read a really interesting article about patents, and Dale Carnegie, you know who Dale Carnegie is, famous historical.
Took the course.
He said that if, he went down to the patent office, I don't know whether he did it himself, and he said when you look at it, basically every patent in the last 100 years is just a reorganization and a repurposing of what they call basic patents. And there's very few new basic patents that are submitted. Almost all patents, 90-some%, are simply pulling together other patents for a new purpose or repurposing an old patent for something new. And his point was that creativity is not about the God moment where suddenly this idea from the ether enters into your mind. It's actually a cognitive ability that you can practice and enhance and grow, that you can pull these different parts together and create something new. And that's what creative imagination is.
Cool. That's an interesting distinction. Thanks.
Yeah, I thought that was a pretty cool distinction. And this is about where we're going to take a little bit of a break here. But I just want to touch, before we leave this area, I want to talk about how neuroimaging and brain therapy have added to our understanding. And over the last decade, there's been a lot of advances in three main areas, okay, for brain health. And now we're talking about the ability of our brain to do what they're meant to do beyond making our heart beat and our lungs filter oxygen out and all the things it does. Imagination has been proven to have a key role in the learning development. So when imagination is stifled, so is learning. They go hand in hand. So imagination, and I read some great educational research on world building and how world building enhances learning in all areas of children. We use it in our schools, actually, in Japan. So Albert Einstein once said, the true sign of intelligence is not knowledge, but imagination.
Wow. You know
and
what?
Albert,
there's a linkage here too between curiosity as well, right? Like that has to be part of this as well, right? Of the process. Well, that'd be great. Yeah.
I think that curiosity is that drive to take parts that don't fit together and make them into something.
Right. Yeah.
You know, as a kid, I used to love taking puzzles and mixing them together and trying to make them into something new.
Yeah.
In my mind, why couldn't you just take pieces from multiple puzzles and put them together? The fit was more important than the image, right? So that's kind of where that's pulled together. So there's a really cool thing, and we should talk about this on some show, called Pi. And Pi is a philosophy in learning. First time I heard about it, but it's becoming really popular. And that's a little acronym when you entwine, so E, place and image, the memory is much stronger in your long-term memory. And when I was reading this, you know, in my day, there was the whole, what's it called? Thought palace, memory palace, right? Do you remember that whole thing where you have an imaginary palace where you place a memory like on the second floor drawing room, and
like, imagine so this is a mnemonic, a way to that you can remember a list of things is that you create in your no? Oh, okay. Some guys, that's how they teach memories, right? Is that you kind of create a space, you kind of create a room, and then you just, you know, you place the items you want to remember, like let's say a list of things in there, right? And you use that tool to then recall. Okay, that was in the.
That's right.
Yeah,
but a mnemonic is like rainbow, right? Prince Charles. I can't remember what the mnemonic is. Where you take the first letter of the word, and so you remember some silly little saying that helps you remember what it is you're trying to remember. That's mnemonic triggers. Mnemonic from the sound of the first letter.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. Yeah. You described. I can't remember whether it's called memory palace but yeah, you create a place and an image in your mind. And so Pi is the intertwining of place, image, and memory, or an event, or whatever it is you're trying to remember. And that the ability to learn when you use Pi far exceeds any other method of remembering or learning something. Really? So that if you can attach a visual memory and a location, a spatial relationship to that memory, it will survive much longer than if you did not.
That's very interesting. Well, okay, so it's basically engaging more senses into that memory. Would that not be true?
Well, and it's very interesting you say that, because when I said I went back and I was reading French and Greek philosophers on imagination, they described it as sensuous. Not meaning like we think of sex and sensuous, but as related to the senses. So for those philosophers, imagination was a type, I'm taking liberties, but a type of sense. It was related to the senses. It was sensuous from the senses in nature. So you're exactly right. Okay, so number one is enhanced learning ability. That we're learning imagination can be used to help people with learning disabilities. It can be help people like everyone learn, remember longer, build keys. Okay, the second area that imagination is being used medically is recovery from brain injury. This is a big one. And the synapses in the brain, and this was also covered in that movie you shared with us, Fantastic Fungi, right?
Yeah.
And so imagination, and that was a simpatico theory with the Fantastic Fungi, is that it helps our neural pathways become more flexible. It helps them create new ones. It expands our understanding and our ability to access them. And so evidence pointing, I'm quoting, evidence pointing to building an active imagination is a key role in synaptic growth. More researchers in the last decade have been studying the therapeutic effects of visualization in repairing brain tissue after traumatic injury than at any other time in history. So there's a strong presence right now in how imagination and related aids to imagination help the therapeutic recovery from brain injury. Also, it can be used to treat stroke patients, and it's being looked into a way in the last 10 years or so as a way to combat aging. And the brain doesn't have to just atrophy. That's something we're finding out. When I was a kid,
let me interject. You and I have had this conversation before about the black man who's like 94 years old in the wheelchair, all slumped over, not paying attention to anybody. And then they put the headphones on with music from his era when he was like in his 30s and 40s kind of a thing. And he like perks up like, boom, right now. 5 seconds. He's like he came out of a coma, and then started humming along and singing and just like happy like crazy. It's incredible. When you talk about memory, you talk about imagination, music, singing has a way to kind of enhance that memory and make it from all parts of your brain or something. Like it connects, I think it connects all parts of your brain in that experience is what happens.
And it's really interesting because in those treatises I was reading, they were making connections between the semantic senses that are touch, all of those things, and imagination. And it's only later that we separate them, and now we're coming back to bring them together. Imagination is being reconsidered as something, as a cognitive ability. It's a sense. It's something a tool we as human beings can learn to use to improve and grow. We're going to talk about that in next show. But let me just finish.
Did you also look up the Albert Einstein quote about imagination, what that one says?
Which one? He had many. He was a big fan of imagination. Yeah.
Hey, Google, what was the most famous quote on imagination by Albert Einstein? No, that's good. Imagination is more important than knowledge. That was Albert one.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about.
Yeah.
In step one. Yeah. But he has a couple more that are very interesting about imagination. I'll have them ready for you for next show.
Cool.
So recovery from brain injury, and now we're looking at it as a way to prevent natural brain decay, or natural, meaning we've never really thought about slowing it down or stopping it before, and now we are. So the third thing, and this is really interesting, is called augmented adaptability. I love these terms people come up with. It just rolls off the tongue. Except I can't say it. Augmented adaptability. And another word for that is strategic imagination. Isn't that another great term? Strategic imagination.
Good. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and
tell me more. Or is that for next episode?
No. I need to finish this one off because we got a full episode next time on other parts of imagination.
Okay, so tell me more.
Yeah. So what and management is getting behind this, business is getting behind this, visionaries like your favorite man, Elon Musk, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. You know, a lot of people are going back and saying these guys had strategic imagination. And what that is, and this is a skill that strengthens synapses, helps create new synapses, like our brain on steroids. And this is something anyone can do. Like a lot of people I've heard say, oh, I have no imagination. We all have it. It's like saying I have no little toe. I'm sure there's a few people that were born without little toes, but most of us have little toes, right? They're getting smaller because we don't use them anymore, right? They used to be this, like our toes were longer. Anyway, so
when everybody was barefoot, like you mean?
Probably, and golf, booing and singing. So reasoning and rationale used to be considered separate from imagination, right? Imagination was dreaming, where thinking was different.
That's serious work getting shit done, where imagination
we don't sit around and dream. Come on now. We're realizing that was way off base, not true at all. And that when we imagine a situation, we build and strengthen our synapses for that. And so I'll go back to the military example because it's one that's really like DARPA. They come up with all sorts of stuff. But a SEAL team runs a breach. So if they know they're going to have, if there's a hostage situation, I'll give you an example. A bus used to be a classic hijack situation. So a special forces joint task force in Canada, a SEAL team in the US, they would train entering a bus over and over and over and over and over again. They would have explosives going off. They would have screaming, yelling. But the more times they do it, the more it strengthens. And now we know why. We knew it was effective. But now with brain science and imaging, it actually builds up our synapses. And it makes us stronger to the point that we can think rationally through that situation. So if we've imagined a situation, we don't actually remember I said in the beginning, we now believe that imagination and reality are extremely close in the way our brain processes them. Right. So you don't actually have to go through something to gain the benefit of being able to go through it calmly and effectively making decisions.
And in an environment where you know there is no physical threat to you, right? Like you can do it, you can do it. And all of the things that happen or that are occurring that are there, none of them will actually kill you. They're just basically inputs that you are going to learn how to manage, basically, here's how I solve this problem, here's how I solve this problem. It kind of reminds me of an IPSC stage. You know what I mean? You set it up. You think, here's what I'm going to do, and I'm going to do the mag change here. I'm going to run over there. I'm going to do this mag change here, and blah blah blah. And yeah. No, it makes sense.
Have you seen they're about 5 or 6 years old, maybe 10 years old now, the Sherlock Holmes series that had what's his name in it? And the fight scenes mentally before he was in a fight scene, he would go, if I did this, then this would happen. He'd go through the whole sequence.
He's going to do this and do that and kick here and punch there. Yeah, like that. Yeah.
That's augmented adaptability. And we can all do that. We just have to imagine the situation that we're going to have to face. And that's where they believe, they know now that leaders practice this ability. They say, okay, I'm going to go in that boardroom and this is a possible, Joe's going to say this, Mary's going to say that.
I got to share this with you. I'm sorry to interrupt. I had lunch with Chris today, who runs Lethbridge Dopamine. And Lethbridge Dopamine, one of their programs is a boxing program for people who have Parkinson's disease. And the activity of them boxing helps them so much with their mobility and their overall strength and their overall cognition, just that activity of boxing.
I helped a fellow that used to come down to the range all the time. And I haven't been ROing physically that way for a while, but he had MS quite badly. I don't know if you ever encountered him. It was really hard, like bolt action rifle, like to keep his eye on the scope and the target and work the action of the rifle. And he didn't want any help. He wanted to do it all himself. And he said that for him, that was like, it helped him with eating. It helped him with, toiletries and just that constant, that making himself do that motion And I don't know if he ever hit the backstop even, you know, it was like pretty rough. But boy, the dedication and just that, like you said, pushing through all of the physical angst that his body was under, he was exerting his control over the situation, and that helped him in talking to him. And I didn't associate it to this, but you know, he said it made so many things in his life easier because he did that. And this is kind of what augmented adaptability is. And it's the ability to walk through a variety of situations vividly and realistically in our mind. And the more we engage in this practice, it's proven the more entrenched our neural pathways, and they can visualize it now through neuroimaging, that, you know, if you mentally walk down that path over and over again, that it becomes easier in reality to walk down that path and not get flustered when the bridge goes out or whatever happens, because you are prepared. And if you've done it, the real life occurrence goes down much smoother. Our reaction times are faster, and that's where it's being used in the military. They train so that, you know, their reflexes take over. Their mind isn't worried about all of, you know, this guy, this going on, that happening. It's focused right on what's going on. And that's called augmented adaptability. And I read some great articles in management, this is where I'm going to finish, about how leadership now is being taught to use augmented adaptability as a management tool for managers and decision makers to do their job more effectively, with less stress, less burnout, and less collateral damage to the people around them and their companies.
Wow. So you heard it here. H3 next week. We're going to discuss that. How exciting is that? Okay, Brother Scott, take us home, brother.
From my friend, the acapellist Alan Friesen, and myself, Scott Sweetman, thank you for joining us tonight. Remember, if anything we've said triggered you, please get some help. We don't know what we're talking about. We're just doing our best out here. But we'll be back next week with some good news, probably some singing, because the acapellist, he loves to sing. So good night, everyone. Thanks for coming. We'll see you next week, Thursday at the same time, same place, Just TV.
Get 'em, Matson. See you.